I still remember the night it happened, the night my own family turned their backs on me. I had always known that money mattered to them more than love, but I never imagined they would go as far as to throw me out of the house that had been my only safe place. My name is Emily Carter, and I grew up in a family that valued wealth, status, and appearances above everything else. We weren't always rich, but when my father's business began to flourish, my parents became obsessed with maintaining a certain image in society. Expensive clothes, lavish parties, and showing off their success became more important than the people inside the home. I, however, never fit into that world. Unlike my siblings, who loved designer clothes and fancy dinners, I preferred books, quiet moments, and dreams of building something meaningful on my own. I worked small jobs while studying, trying to find my own path instead of relying on my parents' wealth. That independence was something they never appreciated. The breaking point came when my father's business went into crisis. Bad investments, greedy partners, and poor decisions drained the money that once flowed so easily. The fancy cars were sold, the parties stopped, and suddenly, the family that had looked down on others now felt the sting of financial struggle. But instead of coming together to rebuild, the blame game started, and as the daughter who earned little and refused to marry into money, I became their easiest target. "You're nothing but a burden, Emily," my older brother hissed one evening at dinner. "While the rest of us fight to bring this family back up, you sit there with your part-time jobs that can't even buy groceries." My mother didn't defend me. She simply sighed, her eyes filled with disappointment. "Maybe if you had listened to us earlier, if you had married someone wealthy, we wouldn't be in this situation." Her words stabbed deeper than any knife. Marriage to them wasn't about love, but about status. They wanted me to secure their future through someone else's bank account. That night turned into a storm of arguments. I shouted back, telling them money wasn't everything, that I wasn't going to sell my happiness for their comfort. But in their eyes, I was selfish, ungrateful, and useless. Finally, my father slammed his hand on the table. "Enough! If you can't contribute, you don't belong here. Pack your things, Emily. You're leaving tonight." At first, I thought he was bluffing. But within minutes, my brother dragged an old suitcase into my room, throwing my clothes inside with cold efficiency. My mother watched from the hallway, silent, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Don't come back until you have something to show for yourself." My father's voice echoed as I was pushed out the door. "We don't need dead weight in this family." The door slammed shut behind me, and for the first time in my life, I was truly homeless. I stood in the cold night air, clutching my suitcase, tears streaming down my face. My so-called family, the people I had trusted most, had chosen money over blood. I felt broken, worthless, and utterly alone. That night, I slept on a friend's couch. The humiliation burned inside me. My relatives whispered about me, saying I had been cut off because I was lazy, because I had no ambition. None of them knew the truth, that I had dreams, just not the kind they wanted for me. But as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, something inside me shifted. The pain was still raw, but underneath it, a spark ignited. If my family thought I was worthless because I was poor, then I would prove them wrong. I would rise, not just to survive, but to thrive. And one day, I would return so successful, so powerful, that the same family who had thrown me away would regret ever underestimating me. That was the night my journey truly began. The night I decided that being poor would not be my ending. It would be the fuel for my revenge. The first weeks after being thrown out were the hardest days of my life. I had left my family's house with nothing but a small suitcase and the determination not to give up. My friend Clara let me stay on her couch, but I could see the strain it put on her family. I hated being a burden, even to someone kind enough to help me. So, I began searching for work, anything that could pay for food and a place to stay. I applied at cafes, bookstores, and even cleaning services. Some laughed at my lack of experience. Others told me I was overqualified. Finally, I landed a part-time job at a local coffee shop, serving lattes and cleaning tables for long hours. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me enough to rent a tiny room in a rundown neighborhood. At night, I cried silently, missing the comfort of a home that no longer welcomed me. I remembered my father's harsh words, my mother's silence, and my brother's cruel smirk. They had made me believe I was worthless. But every day I forced myself to get up, and work was proof that I wasn't. I lived simply, cutting every unnecessary expense. My meals were cheap, my clothes secondhand, but I carried myself with quiet pride. I was earning my own way, something my family had never respected. And while they looked down on me, I started to build strength they could never take away. One rainy evening, exhausted from work, I stopped at a bookstore. The smell of old pages calmed me, and I wandered until I found myself in the business section. Titles like Starting from Zero and The Power of Persistence caught my eye. I scraped together the little money I had and bought one book that would change my life forever: How to Build Wealth from Nothing. I devoured every page, underlining passages, writing notes in the margins. For the first time, I felt like I had a roadmap. The book spoke of discipline, saving, investing, and building skills. It wasn't about luck or handouts. It was about strategy and persistence. I began applying those lessons immediately. From my tiny income at the coffee shop, I saved every coin I could. I taught myself new skills online: digital marketing, writing, and eventually e-commerce. I spent nights at the library using free Wi-Fi to learn what others paid thousands of dollars for. Meanwhile, I heard bits of news about my family. They were still struggling. My father's debts piled up. My brother made risky investments that failed. And my mother desperately tried to maintain their social image, even as their wealth crumbled. They still looked down on me, of course, spreading rumors that I was barely surviving. They had no idea that my struggle was shaping me into someone stronger than they could ever imagine. Months passed, and I took my first big leap. Using my savings, I started a small online shop, selling handmade crafts and accessories. At first, orders were slow, but I promoted relentlessly, reaching out on social media, learning how to attract customers. Slowly, sales began to trickle in. Then, word of mouth spread. Within a year, my little shop was generating more income than my coffee shop job. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. I wasn't rich yet, but I had built something with my own two hands. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. One night, while closing my laptop, after fulfilling another batch of orders, I looked out the window of my tiny apartment. The city lights flickered in the distance, and a thought came to me, sharp and clear. One day, I'll rise above them all. One day, they'll regret ever calling me a burden. That thought became my fuel. I was no longer just surviving. I was preparing for something bigger, something greater. And while my family mocked me in their ignorance, I was quietly laying the foundation of an empire they would never see coming. 2 years had passed since the night I was thrown out. In those 2 years, I had gone from a girl with nothing but a suitcase to a woman who had built a modest but growing business. My online shop was steady. I had learned countless new skills, and I was no longer just scraping by. I was saving, planning, and dreaming bigger. But I knew this wasn't enough. If I truly wanted to rise above, if I wanted to return to my family, not as the poor, helpless girl they discarded, but as someone far greater, I needed to take a bold step. That step came unexpectedly. One evening, while working on my laptop at the coffee shop, a well-dressed woman approached me. She had noticed me managing orders, replying to customers, and handling business all while sipping a cheap cup of coffee. Her name was Mrs. Dalton, a retired entrepreneur who had once built and sold a successful fashion company. "I've been watching you these past few weeks," she said, smiling kindly. "You work hard. Tell me, what exactly are you building?" At first, I was embarrassed, but I explained my little online store. She listened intently, nodding, asking sharp questions, and by the end of our conversation, she leaned back and said, "You have potential, Emily, but you're thinking too small. If you want to grow, you'll need vision, investment, and courage." Her words struck me deeply. For days afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about them. She was right. I was surviving, yes, but I wasn't reaching high enough. And if I ever wanted my family to regret what they'd done, I needed to aim far beyond their imagination. So I started researching larger ventures. I noticed a rising trend in sustainable fashion, eco-friendly clothing and accessories that appealed to young people around the world. With my background in crafts and my online experience, it was the perfect next step. The problem was money. Scaling up required resources I didn't yet have. But instead of giving up, I remembered something from that first book I had read. Opportunities don't come to those who wait. They come to those who prepare. I prepared. I drew up business plans, prototypes, marketing strategies. I worked late into the night, my fingers raw from sewing, my mind buzzing with possibilities. Finally, when I felt ready, I reached out to Mrs. Dalton again. Nervously, I showed her everything I had created. She flipped through my sketches, my spreadsheets, my designs. Then she looked up at me with a spark in her eyes. "You're ready," she said, "and I'll help you." That moment changed everything. Mrs. Dalton introduced me to a network of investors and mentors. She didn't hand me success on a silver plate. No, she tested me, pushed me, challenged me. But with her guidance and my relentless drive, doors began to open. Within months, my sustainable fashion brand was born. At first, it was small, an online launch with a few collections. But demand grew rapidly. People loved the designs, the message, the story of resilience behind the brand. Soon, I had employees, a small office, and contracts with international suppliers. The girl who once begged her family for acceptance was now leading a company. But I wasn't just building for myself. Every step I took, I thought of them. The father who said I was dead weight, the brother who laughed at my poverty, the mother who turned her face away as I was pushed out. They had planted this fire in me, and I would make sure they felt its heat. Then came the day I saw them again. I had been invited to speak at a local business conference, sharing my journey as a young entrepreneur. As I stood backstage, preparing to go on, I scanned the crowd, and there they were, my family, my father, my mother, and my brother, sitting stiffly among the audience, their faces pale with recognition. For a second, my heart faltered. Memories of that night rushed back. The slammed door, the cold words, the loneliness. But then I reminded myself, I wasn't the same girl anymore. I walked onto that stage with my head high, greeted the audience, and began to tell my story. Not the polished version, but the raw truth. I spoke about being thrown out, about surviving on scraps, about fighting for a dream when everyone said I couldn't. I didn't use their names, but every word was aimed at them. The audience applauded, inspired, moved. My family sat frozen, their pride crumbling, as the world celebrated the daughter they had once discarded. That night, as I left the stage to a standing ovation, I caught my brother's eyes. His smugness was gone, replaced with something else, fear. For the first time, they realized I wasn't the failure they thought I was. I was becoming something far more dangerous to their ego, living proof that their judgment had been wrong. And this was only the beginning. After the conference, my life changed rapidly. Overnight, my inbox flooded with opportunities, partnership requests, media interviews, collaboration offers. People wanted to know the girl who had risen from nothing to build a brand making waves in the sustainable fashion industry. But success, I realized, wasn't just about recognition. It was about power, the kind I had been denied all my life, the kind my family once thought I would never have. And with every deal I signed, with every milestone I achieved, I felt that power growing in me. I invested every dollar wisely. Instead of wasting money on luxury for myself, I poured it into expanding the business. We opened a physical store downtown. Its clean glass windows showcasing the bold statement, "Made with resilience." Customers loved it, not just the clothes, but the message. My brand wasn't just fashion. It was survival turned into beauty. By the end of the year, I wasn't just comfortable. I was wealthy. My company was valued in millions. My name appeared in business magazines. And I had a team of employees who believed in me. Yet despite everything, there was a part of me that still burned with unfinished business. My family had thrown me out, had humiliated me, had treated me like I was nothing, and though I had forgiven the pain that pushed me forward, I couldn't ignore the thought of revenge. Not petty revenge, but a lesson they would never forget. The opportunity presented itself sooner than I expected. One afternoon, I received an email from a prestigious real estate firm. They were selling a large estate, a beautiful house with sprawling gardens, located in the very same neighborhood where my family still lived. The house had once belonged to an old friend of my father, but now it was on the market. I knew immediately what I had to do. Without hesitation, I signed the deal. Cash. No loans, no hesitation. In less than a month, the estate was mine. And just like that, I became not only wealthier than my family, but also their neighbor. The first time I drove past my family's house in a sleek black car, their reactions were everything I had imagined. My brother stood outside, watering plants, when he saw me step out in a tailored suit. His jaw dropped, the hose slipping from his hands. My mother peered out the window, frozen, and my father's face darkened with disbelief. For years they had treated me like the outcast, the failure, the shame of the family. Now, I was the one living in a mansion bigger than theirs, with cars they couldn't afford, with staff that greeted me at the gates. But the real moment of triumph came weeks later. I was invited to a charity gala in the city, and I knew my family would be there. They never missed a chance to show off their social status. I arrived in style, cameras flashing, reporters calling my name, and when I stepped onto the stage to accept an award for entrepreneurship, I locked eyes with them in the crowd. Their expressions were priceless. My father's pride cracked into bitterness, my mother's eyes filled with regret, and my brother, once so smug, looked small and defeated. During my speech, I spoke words that were aimed straight at them. Sometimes, the people closest to us don't believe in us. Sometimes, they even abandon us. But that doesn't define who we are. What defines us is the strength to rise anyway. The room erupted in applause. My family couldn't clap. That night they tried to approach me. My mother hesitated, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Emily, maybe we could talk." My father stood rigid, saying nothing, while my brother avoided my eyes. For a moment, the little girl in me wanted to forgive them instantly. But then I remembered the night they slammed the door on me, how they left me with nothing, how they had laughed while I cried. I smiled politely and replied, "I'm afraid I don't have time right now. Perhaps another day." And I walked away, leaving them behind just as they had once left me. From that day forward, everything shifted. People in town whispered about me, not as the poor girl cast out of her family, but as the woman who had surpassed them all. Invitations that once went to my parents now came directly to me. My name carried weight that theirs no longer did. I didn't just build a company, I built an empire. And with every step higher, my family sank deeper into regret. But I wasn't done yet, because while I had taken my revenge in silence, I knew there was one final confrontation waiting, one where I would look them in the eye, and they would finally understand what they had lost when they threw me away, and that moment was coming sooner than they thought. The months that followed my gala speech felt surreal, like living inside a dream that had once been my worst nightmare. Invitations kept coming. Partners called with offers I had only dared imagine. And my life had rearranged itself into a rhythm of meetings, product launches, and philanthropic work. Yet nothing compared to the ache I still carried for what my family had taken from me. Not just the years, but the dignity, the trust, the simple right to belong. I had grown wealthy and powerful, yes, but I had not forgotten the hollow look on my mother's face the night I left. I had not forgotten my father's slamming hand on the table, and I had not forgotten my brother's cruel smirk. I had planned so many small victories, buying the estate next door, winning awards, turning the town's whispers into applause. But there was one thing I wanted more than spectacle. I wanted them to understand the cost of what they had done. Not just to see me succeed, but to feel the truth of what happens when you throw away a life. For some, that might sound cruel. For me, it felt necessary. It was the only way to close the circle without surrendering to bitterness. The opportunity presented itself in a way I hadn't expected. A family reunion was announced. A charity event my father's old business partner was organizing. Naturally, they would attend. The social optics were too important for them to miss. I could have ignored it, sent a gracious note, or had one of my assistants make a generous donation in my name. But something inside me pushed for a more direct ending, a final chapter where I would speak my truth and reclaim the narrative for good. On the day of the reunion, I arrived quietly. My appearance was deliberate but not ostentatious. I wanted power, not pretense. The room buzzed with polite conversations and forced laughter. But underneath that hum was the familiar tension of people protecting reputations. When they saw me, silence spread like a shadow. My father's face, usually so composed, went pale. My mother's hand trembled on the arm of her chair. My brother looked as if the room had suddenly shrunk. I moved through the crowd with calm purpose. I greeted acquaintances and accepted congratulations with gracious nods. No gloating, no chest thumping. I wanted my presence to hum with the quiet assurance that comes from doing the hard work and surviving. Finally, I stood at the small stage the organizers had set up and waited until a hush fell. The reunion's host gave me a polite nod, and I began to speak. "I am not here for a spectacle," I said, my voice steady, carrying across the room. "I am here because this gathering is where we can be honest about what family means." I looked directly at my parents, then at my brother. I did not shout. I told the story plainly. The night I had been pushed out, the words that had been said, the countless nights I had slept in, borrowed places, and worked jobs that left my hands raw. I spoke of humiliation, of tears in the dark, but also of the small victories that had built the life I now led. I did not accuse for the sake of revenge. I spoke to make them see, to show the chain of choices that led from their greed to my exile, and finally to my return. The room was silent, even the weightier guests leaning forward. My father's jaw tightened. My mother's eyes filled. My brother's fingers clenched at his glass. When I finished, I did not beg for apologies. I offered a choice: acknowledgement or continued silence. "You can either join me in building something that matters," I said, "or you can live with what you chose." Their reaction was immediate and messy. My mother rushed forward halfway, tears streaking down her face, murmuring apologies that sounded almost rehearsed. My father stood stiff and spoke something about pride and mistakes, while my brother, smaller than I ever remembered him, stammered, "Emily, I'm sorry." The words hung between us, fragile and inadequate. I listened. I let them speak. Then, when the moment felt right, I walked over to the table where my brother sat and placed an envelope in front of him. He looked at it, puzzled. Inside were copies of documents, bank statements and contracts. The same type of evidence that had once allowed him to take from me. This time, though, the papers were accompanied by a note. "You were given every chance to do better. You chose the wrong path. I have chosen mine." It was an odd small gesture. Neither legal hammer nor melodramatic trap. I wanted him to feel the weight of accountability, without shaming him into silence. My goal was not to ruin him in front of everyone. It was to strip away the illusion of dominance he had wrapped around himself. And in that room, with polite society watching, his mask fell. He could not rebuild the past with a few whispered apologies. The wounds were real, and the world had seen them. Over the following months, my family tried to come back into my life in fits and starts. My mother called with long apologies and invitations for coffee. My brother sent messages that vacillated between remorse and requests for help. My father, quieter now, found himself attending events where my name was spoken with respect he once basked in. I entertained some conversations, refused others, and slowly drew boundaries that protected me from falling back into old patterns. Forgiveness, I learned, was not a single act. It was a process that required honest change from both parties. I did not revenge to revel in their suffering. I wanted truth and reform. So I made an offer, public forgiveness, in exchange for concrete action. I proposed collaborating on a community project, funds for vocational training, small business grants for people from my old neighborhood, and scholarships for young women who, like I once did, had been underestimated. My terms were clear. No public grandstanding, real commitment, and equal responsibility. If they agreed, we'd build together. If not, I would build without them. My father hesitated for weeks, pride wrestling with the opportunity to restore the family name honestly. My brother resisted, his ego still sticky with old habits. My mother, who finally looked hollowed by regret and fear, pushed them to accept. Eventually they agreed, not out of sudden enlightenment, but out of pragmatism and the desire to be near the goodwill my name now generated. Working with them was awkward and humbling. There were moments of genuine cooperation and moments that reminded me of the past. But over time, true change crept in. My brother took training seriously, not as a cover for self-advancement, but as a real effort to rebuild his character. My father learned to listen, to let others lead. And my mother, well, she learned to be kind without expecting applause in return. Change was messy, slow, and sometimes insufficient, but it was real. Years later, when I walked past the roses in my garden, roses I had planted after buying the estate, I often thought about that final reunion. Revenge had been satisfying in its justice. Success had been sweeter than anything I had imagined. But the thing that surprised me most was what came after. The possibility of repair. Not full erasure of the pain, but the chance to build something better from the ruins. In the quiet of my home, I kept a framed photo of the young woman I had been, hair tangled from stress, eyes rimmed with sleeplessness, face set with stubborn resolve. It reminded me of the cost of rising and the price of remaining true to myself. I had been thrown out for being poor, yes, but I had returned richer than them all. Not only in wealth, but in purpose, dignity, and the capacity to choose who I would be. If they regretted what they had done, that regret belonged to them. I had done more than make them pay. I had made myself whole. And in the end, that was the only revenge I ever needed.